Ludwig van Beethoven, along with Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, was one of the greatest classical composers. The classical period of music occurred between the years 1750 to 1825. The hallmarks of this period of music were balance and order. The music was carefully defined and arranged, and broke away from the highly complex and ornamented music of the Baroque period, when composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel reigned. Beethoven revolutionized the form and spirit of music during the classical period, becoming the first composer to earn a living from the sale of his compositions. He was an independent and spirited man, and at the time when composers were regarded as servants of the aristocracy, Beethoven considered himself one of their members. Although highly irregular for the time, the aristocracy respected Beethoven and treated him as an equal. As a result of his prestige, Beethoven was fortunate enough to write only those compositions he wanted to write, rather than compositions an archbishop or king ordered him to create. Beethoven became the forerunner of music of the Romantic period, when new, rich, and colorful musical forms began to emerge. Beethoven's compositional output is frequently categorized into three different periods: early, middle, and late. Each period corresponds chronologically with his life, and each period also features distinct musical qualities that set it apart from his other compositional periods. Beethoven's first period, or the early period, was marked by Beethoven trying to find his place in Viennese musical society. His early period saw him trying to emulate the sounds of his predecessors, Haydn and Mozart, while simultaneously trying to find his own musical voice. The end result is that we have a period of music that sounds highly influenced by the styles of Viennese culture, while we can also hear the beginning of ideas that would be staples of Beethoven's middle and late periods.
Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Bonn, a city on the Rhine River in Germany, on December 16, 1770. His father and grandfather were both professional musicians, and Ludwig's father, Johann van Beethoven, was eager for his son to become like Mozart, another musical genius whose expertise was evident at a very young age. When he was only 4 years old, Beethoven's father began instructing him. Every day he studied violin, piano, and composition. When Beethoven was 7 years old, he had his first known public performance in Cologne. His father advertised his age as 6 years, although he was in fact 7, probably to draw favorable comparisons with the child prodigy Mozart. Then, when he was 9 years old, a musician friend of his father's, Tobias Pfeiffer, became his teacher. Oftentimes, after spending all night at an alehouse, Beethoven's father and Pfeiffer would return home and wake him up from sleep to give him music lessons, no matter what time of the night it was. When Beethoven was about 12 years old, he began to study the 48 preludes and fugues of Johann Sebastian Bach, a famous German Baroque composer and organist. He found great inspiration in Bach's preludes and fugues. At this young age, only a year after his first published composition, Beethoven obtained a paid position as a second court organist. It was at this time that Beethoven composed our first selection today, an early period piece, Rondo in C major, Wu 48. Before Otters performs, it is worth noting how music was categorized for Beethoven's pieces. Many pieces have an opus or work number along with a corresponding movement. Wu numbers, or works without numbers, is a German musical catalog prepared in 1955 by George Kinski and Hans Halm, listing all of the compositions of Beethoven that were not originally published with an opus number, or survived only as fragments. This first piece today is among the earliest surviving compositions of Beethoven, who was a mere 13 years old when he wrote it. He managed to get it published immediately in a popular weekly musical publication in Germany, one of the first works of his ever to be printed. This obscure little rondo is not to be dismissed as an insignificant piece of juvenilia. It actually contains several elements that identify it as a work of the mature master to come. Humor is already present here, and the young composer also shows a grasp of color in the ending. This piece is a good observation of Beethoven's development. Otters will now perform Rondo in C major, Wu 48.
At the age of 17, Beethoven visited Vienna, a city famous for musical activity. While on his first visit to Vienna, he had the opportunity to play for Mozart, who was very impressed by Beethoven's ability to improvise or to make up music on the spur of the moment. When listening to Beethoven's performances, Mozart supposedly said, "Someday he will give the world something worth listening to." Barely 2 weeks after arriving, he had impressed Mozart so much that Mozart agreed to take him on as a pupil. However, Beethoven had to return to Bonn, where his mother was dying of consumption. By the time he returned to Vienna nearly 5 years later, Mozart had died. Upon arriving in Bonn, 1 month short of his 22nd birthday, Beethoven began studying with Haydn. He had been given 6 months leave of absence from his position in Bonn and ended up staying in Vienna for the rest of his life, never to return to his hometown. Several of Vienna's most influential musical patrons, notably Prince Lichnowsky, took Beethoven under their wing and put him forward to take on the city's piano virtuosos in improvisation contests. One after the other, he defeated them and quickly established his reputation as the finest piano virtuoso in Vienna. After Beethoven completed his studies with Haydn, he decided to settle in Vienna to diligently pursue composing and performing. His first public concert was when he was 25 years old and earned him enormous praise. Beethoven became the first great composer to work without the aid of a wealthy benefactor. His independence made it difficult for him to serve one family. He felt he performed and expressed himself best when serving the public. Now we will be presenting some unknown works assumed to be written at this time, around 1795. Sonatina in F, to be performed by Thomas, is a composition for solo piano in 2 movements. A sonatina is a small sonata. It tends to be shorter and lighter in character, or technically less challenging than a typical sonata. Both movements are in 2/4 time. Most of the first movement is in 16th notes, and the second movement is in 8th notes. Following Thomas will be his brother Benjamin, playing Minuet in G Wu 10 No. 2. A minuet is a slow, stately ballroom dance for 2 and triple meter, especially popular in the 18th century. This selection is in AABA form and written for orchestra, but only the piano arrangement could be found. Thomas and Benjamin will now be playing Sonatina in F and Minuet in G.
Our next two pieces to be performed by Armand and Chloe encompass a full sonatina, a small sonata in 2 movements. The Sonatina in G is a composition attributed to Beethoven, published in Hamburg, Germany after Beethoven's death. Its authenticity is doubtful as it uses styles never seen by Beethoven before. However, it is still attributed to him. Armand will perform the first movement, Moderato. Chloe will perform movement 2, Romance.
Around the age of 26 in 1796, Beethoven began to hear buzzing and ringing in his ears. In 1800, he wrote from Vienna to a childhood friend, by then working as a doctor in Bonn, saying that he had been suffering for some time. For the last 3 years, my hearing has grown steadily weaker. I can give you some idea of this peculiar deafness when I must tell you that in the theater I have to get very close to the orchestra to understand the performers, and that from a distance I do not hear the high notes of the instruments in the singers' voices. Sometimes, too, I can hardly hear people who speak softly. The sound I can hear, it is true, but not the words. And yet if anyone shouts, I can't bear it. Beethoven tried to keep the news of the problem secret from those closest to him. He feared his career would be over if anyone found out. For 2 years, I've avoided almost all social gatherings because it is impossible for me to say to people, I am deaf, Beethoven wrote. If I belonged to any other profession, it would be easier, but in my profession, it is a frightful state. Beethoven could apparently still hear some speech and music until 1812, but by the age of 44, he was almost totally deaf and unable to hear voices or so many of the sounds of his beloved countryside. It must have been devastating for him.
If Beethoven couldn't hear, one would ask, how did he write music? Beethoven had heard and played music for the first 3 decades of his life, so he knew how instruments and voices sounded and how they worked together. His deafness was a slow deterioration rather than a sudden loss of hearing, so he could always imagine in his mind what his compositions would sound like. Beethoven's housekeepers remembered that, as his hearing got worse, he would sit at the piano, put a pencil in his mouth, touching the other end of it to the soundboard of the instrument to feel the vibration of the note. Our next 5 pieces are early period sonatas, the first of which was a piece used for teaching piano. Of the small output for the 4-hands piano by Beethoven, the most important is the 2-movement sonata in D, opus 26, published in 1797. It's generally considered as having been conceived as a teaching piece, given its relatively modest technical challenges and the absence of documentation for any public performance. Nevertheless, it presents some interesting points. For example, the recapitulation is ornamented in both movements, breaking away from the Mozart-esque tradition of a straight re-exposition. Rose and Mrs. Hanson will now be performing this piece.
next sonata was written in 1798 and published in 1799. Sonata in C minor, Opus 13, number 1. The Sonata Pathétique was an important success for Beethoven, selling well and helping create his reputation as a composer, not just as an extraordinary pianist. Not only was it instantly popular, it also exposed the world to the characteristics that Beethoven would continue to develop in the coming years. This composition was dedicated to his friend, Prince Karl von Lichnowsky, one of Beethoven's biggest patrons. Although commonly thought to be one of the few works to be named by the composer himself, it was actually named Grand Sonata Pathétique to Beethoven's liking by the publisher, who was impressed by the sonata's tragic sonorities. The first movement, which we will hear today, is in sonata form. It begins with a slow introductory theme marked grave. The exposition, marked allegro di molto con brio, which means fast with a lot of spirit, is in 2/2 time, alla breath, in the home key of C minor, and features 3 themes. A codetta with ideas from the opening allegro closes the section. This movement is one of the few compositions that contain 128 notes. Pranav will now be performing the first movement of the Pathétique Sonata in C minor.
Sonata in D major, Opus 10, number 3, composed in 1798, was dedicated to the Countess Anne Margaret von Braun, a wife of a famous general in the Imperial Russian Army. Originally, it was written for a competition against other composers in Vienna. The Opus 10 sonatas are usually described as angular or experimental, as Beethoven began moving further and further away from his earlier models. This third sonata of the set is longest at approximately 24 minutes. It is the only one of the Opus 10 sonatas that has 4 movements. The festive opening movement, which we will hear today, though seemingly guileless, contains subversive elements. Beethoven insinuates music which reaches beyond the compass of the keyboards available to him at the time. Following the jaunty first phrases, a downward cascade of notes leads the left hand to one note below the lowest F then possible, and the ensuing upward sweep carries us to a high F sharp, also a note which did not exist on the restricted keyboards of the day. Our modern 8-octave keyboard makes it possible for pianists to play the 2 unwritten but implied notes. Noel will now be performing the first movement of Beethoven's Sonata in D major.
next piece, Theme and Variations, Opus 77, dates from 1801, a very productive period for Beethoven. In that year, he also completed the First Symphony, 2 violin sonatas, and 4 piano sonatas, including the Moonlight Sonata. The critical notes in the Henley edition mention that he first sketched the theme in the summer of 1800 and reused the opening in his piano sonata in B-flat. Variations on an original theme, Opus 77, was marked as faciles, or easy, in the title of the respective first edition. When Beethoven sent a manuscript of the variations on a theme to the lady for whom he had written the work, he is said to have added the words, "They are so easy that the lady should be able to sight read them." It is clear that such remarks were not to be taken too seriously. All 3 variation cycles boast both difficult musical and technical challenges. Kate will now be performing the full set of variations in G major, Opus 77.
Our final sonata, the Piano Sonata number 14 in C sharp minor, opus 27, number 2, is a piano sonata by Beethoven that was completed in 1801 and dedicated in 1802 to one of his pupils. The piece is one of Beethoven's most popular compositions for the piano, and it was a popular favorite even in his own day. Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata in his early 30s after he had finished with some commissioned work. There is no evidence that he was commissioned to write the sonata. The first edition of the score is headed Sonata Quasi Una Fantasia, a title this work shares with its companion piece, opus 27, number 1. Grove Music Online translates the Italian title as Sonata in the Manner of a Fantasy. The title could also be interpreted to imply, as though improvised. The stormy final movement is the weightiest of the three, reflecting an experiment of Beethoven's placement of the most important movement of the sonata as the final movement. The writing has many fast arpeggios and broken chords, strongly accented notes, and fast Alberti bass sequences that fall both into the right and left hands at various times. The C sharp minor sonata, particularly this third movement, is held to have been the inspiration for Frédéric Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu, and that the Fantasy Impromptu was actually a tribute to Beethoven. Of the final movement, Charles Rosen has written, "It is the most unbridled in its representation of emotion. Even today, 200 years later, its ferocity is astonishing." George will now be performing the final movement of Piano Sonata number 14.
Slate period is defined by his increasing use of romantical musical gestures and ideas. The works that were written between 1803 and 1814 are now referred to as his middle period of writing music. We don't have any pieces today from this period, so we will move on to Beethoven's late period. The transition into Beethoven's late period begins with the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, which led to the restoration of the monarchy and a post-war depression that began to change Beethoven's fortunes. With the failure of republicanism, an idea that Beethoven had supported, and the years of warfare that followed caused a lack of available money to be spent for the arts. Beethoven's late period of music focused on writing music almost exclusively for music connoisseurs, and even many of those had a difficult time appreciating the new style. Beethoven also sought to incorporate the polyphonic styles of Bach and Handel into his late period, and as a result, a lot of fugues can be found in these compositions. Our next piece, Echo Says in G Major, Wu 23, was originally composed for wind band, but the score was lost after the performance. One of the performers remembered the melody after Beethoven's death and gave it to Karl Czerny, a former student of Beethoven and a composer of many etudes, who created the arrangement for piano we use today. An echo says is a type of couples folk dance known for its lively rhythms. Even though Beethoven's echo says is easier than his typical works, it still has many stylistic components of his more difficult repertoire. Annika will now be performing Echo Says in G major. Our final piece for today, composed in 1810, is a bagatelle Beethoven drafted but never published. It sat in a drawer until 1822, was revised, put away, and wasn't published until it was found after his death. Bagatelle number 25 in A minor, better known as Für Elise, German for Elise. It is debated that Elise is one of several possible women in Beethoven's life. There was Therese Malfatti, a woman to whom Beethoven proposed in the same year he composed Für Elise, who was the owner of the manuscript. However, other researchers have suggested Elise could have been a German soprano named Elisabeth Rockel. She played Florestan in Beethoven's opera Fidelio, and many sources show that Elizabeth often met with Beethoven, who fell in love with the young woman and wanted to marry her. There is also a third candidate, another German soprano and friend of Beethoven called Elise Barensfeld. Nowadays, Für Elise is undoubtedly one of Beethoven's most famous works. It seems almost strange that at the time it was composed, this piece was relatively incidental. Ria will now be playing our final selection for today, Für Elise.
At the beginning of 1827, Beethoven took to a long illness from which he never recovered. On March 26, 1827, Beethoven died at the age of 56. His cause of death is still debated, but one of the most popular theories is that he died of lead poisoning, where lead may have been a part of his medical treatment. Beethoven's funeral took place on March 29th, and over 20,000 people attended the ceremony as Beethoven was laid to rest. Notably, Franz Schubert was one of the torchbearers. When he died a year later, he requested to be buried beside Beethoven, a wish that was ultimately granted. Beethoven's death ended his late period of composition, which was known for producing some of the most ambitious works of all of Beethoven's compositional periods. Although he was less prolific during this time, he managed to write artistically transcending pieces of music while he was entirely deaf, an accomplishment that is difficult to comprehend. Beethoven left a legacy that was inescapable for future composers. The shadow of Beethoven's musical accomplishments still stands tall today, even in the 21st century, a true testament to the timelessness of his music. Although Beethoven never really invented new musical structures, he took the musical structures of his time to whole new levels that had never been comprehended by people before. Certain works, like the Ninth Symphony, had a profound impact on the future development of music. His Fifth Symphony may be the single most globally recognized piece of music ever written. His piano sonatas and concertos transcended what was capable for that instrument and raised the bar for performers of piano works. Not only has his music been influential, even his lifestyle was influential on society's vision of what an artist looks like. The unscrupulous, long-haired artist who didn't care about authority figures was one of the earliest descriptions of a musical artist, documented in detail with Beethoven. That is an image and attitude that is still associated with musicians today. As Beethoven's music is played in concert halls all across the world, his legacy continues to thrive. A giant in the musical world, and arguably the greatest composer that has ever lived, Beethoven changed what music's role in the world would or could be forever. This brings to a conclusion our exploration of Beethoven's history and piano literature. Thank you.